Welcome back to today's episode of the Lady Landlords Podcast. Have you ever wanted to buy in your local area but afraid of the prices, the competition, the high cost of living? Well, that's what we're going to dive into today with one of our Inner Circle members, Stacy, who just picked up a duplex in New York. So, Stacy, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good. I appreciate you coming on here. Most people that we have in the Lady Landlords group that are either in New York, Florida, California are always like, I can't buy here. I have to look in another state. And you didn't. You said, I want to buy in New York. That's the area I'm sticking in. So I'm so happy that you came on just to share what that looked like, how you were able to do that. So I appreciate it. But just to start with, why don't you introduce yourself to our community here?
Okay, so my name is Stacy, and I was a guidance counselor in my previous life, let's say. So I am currently married for the last 25 years, and my husband and I met while I was in college. We have four children. My oldest is 24, and my youngest is 18, soon to graduate high school. So I have two that have graduated college. Both are living back here at the house, working, and one is going to grad school. I have a daughter who will graduate college next year. And then, like I said, my youngest is graduating high school. So it's been very busy. I've been fortunate and blessed to be a stay-at-home mom for the last 24 years. I worked, like I said, I went to graduate school, worked as a guidance counselor down in Queens for a few years prior to having my son. And then once my son was born and we were still living in Queens, daycare was unaffordable. And I stayed home with the intention of going back. I loved my job and I just never got there because four kids later we moved and it just never worked out. Daycare is what it is and we were fortunate to have me stay home, so I have. And that kind of led me to where I am here now with this. It's kind of a new adventure and a new opportunity for me as a mom entrepreneur and, what's the next step kind of a thing.
Right. So now you're up in the Hudson Valley in New York,
Hmm.
which is not far from me. We're going to have to fix the fact that we've not gotten to meet in person yet, but
I
we
know,
will.
I know.
And I'm moving up your way. So that is, a greater likelihood chance soon. But where did real estate even pop up for you? At what point in time did that decide to become a thing that you might even consider?
So my husband and I had honestly started chatting about it a little bit during COVID. You're
Mhm.
stuck in the house and, you take drives and go on little day trips and stuff. And in my area, right literally on the street that I live off of, were a handful of vacant properties. Some have homes on them, some don't. And, we started to look into it like, oh my gosh, it would be great. Maybe if we got one of those, fixed it up. And, we started looking into that. And that's kind of how it started. And then once everything got through COVID and, you sit down and you're like, okay, are we really serious about trying this? And,
Mm.
I was probably more serious at first. And I know, Becky, you're aware of that as to how we got through this journey. But, Brian is very much a realist and, wants to know the bottom line and the numbers and all of that. So, I'm much more carefree, like, let's take a shot kind of a person. So it was, a good amount of research that went in ahead of time. And
Mhm.
then a friend of mine and I had been chatting about perhaps doing something and using it as an Airbnb. Ultimately, we ended up purchasing that property together. It was going very well, and the time shifted because she felt that she wanted it for her own purpose. She ended up ultimately wanting to live there and not utilize it as an Airbnb. So at that point, given the fact that our plans had changed, she bought me out. No hard feelings. She went about her way and is still happily living in the property, which is great.
Mm.
And I then still had the real estate bug of trying to get something else. So rather than taking the monies that I had already put into that investment and kind of putting it back in the bank, we kind of decided to keep a lookout for what else we could get. And we ended up purchasing the first piece of property, which is a condo right here in the town that I live in, prior to my ever having met you. And, it went well. So far, so
Mm.
good. And then, you start to do some more research and perhaps want to look into getting something more. And I started doing, more and more research, looking up things online. And that's honestly how I stumbled across you, was in Google, and then looked everything up on Facebook.
It's funny how you kind of go through that like transition, right? It kind of starts as that idea, And I love that you had that experience. You had already bought a property before we had started working together. You ended up buying
Hmm.
two. We'll get to that. But I like that you kind of tested out that Airbnb idea. Was there ever a point in time that you thought about going back to being a guidance counselor?
Definitely. I mean, I loved it. I loved the kids. And again, as my own kids were getting older, we always kind of thought, okay, well, maybe now is a good time. Maybe now is a good time. But it's difficult because even once they got older, that let's say they might not need me or an aftercare giver, then they got to the stage of their lives where we did not stop running every single day, whether it be football practice, dance classes, I mean, it's a lot, soccer practices. So then it became an issue that, okay, great, I might be able to go back to work, but am I really going to be done at 3 o'clock in order to get home, take my kids to all their practices? And trust me, I utilized carpools throughout their entire, lives. I mean, I had great friends, great support systems, but, then you miss out on a lot. So we
Right.
just kind of made the decision that I would stay put and stay home, which has been great. I kept very busy for the last 9 years. I will finish up at the end of this month. I volunteered as a school board member in my kids' school district, which has been wonderful and very rewarding. Again, it gave me an opportunity to kind of still be involved in that academic school side of things, but I didn't get paid. So that's only good for so long.
Right. But it was something, and we've talked about it a lot, and I know a lot of the events and the programs that you've put on in that. I do feel like they've brought you joy, but I
Hmm.
also felt like with real estate, you were looking for something that was now yours. PTA, those types of
Exactly.
things, that was still something that kind of supplemented your children and the journey that they were on. But I felt like real estate was you taking back something for you.
Absolutely. And that's been something that, again, I don't know that that's what I set out for in the beginning, but joining the Lady Landlords Facebook page and just meeting people in there and learning from their experiences, and then ultimately connecting with you and joining the Lady Landlords inner circle,
Hmm.
I guess ultimately that's what it was. It was something that I wanted to be able to do for myself and be able to do the next phase of real estate. As you said, I had the two pieces, but let me tell you, it doesn't matter how many books you read or how many articles you read online until you're in it and experiencing it. There's so much that you don't know. And there was so much that it's only been a year since, having been in this environment, and I've learned so much. So,
Well, we're going to get into that. But when you,
yeah.
thinking back to that first Airbnb deal that you did, because listen, I got to applaud you. You went out and you did it, right? That was
Hmm.
something that you didn't say, oh, let me go read some books, or let me go join a program first. You went out and picked up that property with that friend. Thinking back to that, if there was one thing that you could have done differently that you know now that you didn't before you bought that Airbnb, what would it be?
Oh, gosh. I don't know that there was anything that I would specifically change because we
Okay.
both went into it with that intention of, you know, fixing it up. It was a real fixer upper. So it needed a tremendous amount of work. And for months and months, that's what we were doing. And it was great. And then, like I said, things in her personal life had shifted. And she kind of approached me at one point. She fell in love with the property, honestly. It was a little tiny bungalow that was on a lake that's near us. And she
Yeah.
just fell in love with it. It was something so different than what she currently lived in with her family. And again, there were
Yeah.
a lot of extenuating circumstances in her situation. So it was a fine. We parted ways. And, like I said, she's happy living there permanently at this point. So I don't know that
Wow.
I would have changed anything there other than, you know, just I don't want to say it was time wasted because again, I had I known it was going to end that way, would I have maybe still done it the same? Maybe. It still lended itself to a lot of learning experiences of dealing with contractors and dealing with getting supplies and learning the ins
Right.
and outs of dealing with a town and getting permits and so there was still a learning curve even during that time. So I don't know that I would have changed it. Although I did learn that at that point I didn't want to do Airbnb anymore.
I do remember that in our very first call. But I agree. I love the fact that you had that experience, that you went through that process. And then also, I felt like then when we did start working together, you were able to kind of say, I don't want to do this. I do want to do this. These are the things that I like. These are the things that I didn't. Just
Hmm.
how you were saying, I realized the Airbnb was not for me. But when we also did start working together, you already had a door that you were renting at that point in time. Can you share a little bit about how that
Yes.
property came alive?
So after I sold my part of the bungalow, again, instead of taking that money and just putting it back in the bank, my husband and I chatted and I was like, listen, I'm going to reach out to my realtor who I had used previously, and she happens to be a personal friend. So I trusted her. And I just kind of put it out there to her. I said, listen, this is where I'm at. This is what I'm looking
Yeah.
for. I'm not looking to spend X amount of money. This is what I have, and let's see what we can find. And we really kind of let that navigate us, which worked out very well. I believe I
Mhm.
put in 2 offers prior to getting the one that I have. I know there was at least one, but I think there were two. But again, I wasn't getting into a bidding war. It wasn't a rush. It was something that when it was meant to be and the right property came along, it would happen. What I also kind of took away from the Airbnb experience was I kind of wanted something that didn't need a lot of work, and I wanted something that I didn't have to deal with a lot of maintenance on the outside. Because again,
Right.
at this point, I had started learning a little more about real estate, and the more you have to deal with, the more you have to deal with. So ended up being a condo, which I was at first very happy about because it's no frills for me. It has an HOA. So I didn't have to worry about lawn maintenance and snow plowing and any of that. It's basically, they have to abide by all of the HOA rules. So I felt like for
Right.
my first purchase as a landlord, that would be better and kind of get my feet wet. So, and the house itself didn't need a lot of work. It needed a little bit that we were able to put in, but off the top of my head, I'm going to say like $12,000. It wasn't a lot. It was more cosmetic. I repainted, I fixed the floors in the basement, things like that. So it was good too that we had what we had and we didn't really want to go over that amount.
Was allowed you to do some work, right? The Airbnb,
Hmm.
you said it really was a fixer upper, and it sounds like that allowed you to kind of see what that was going to look like. Then I feel like it kind of shifted a little bit to buying something that was much more turnkey, almost ready to go, minimal kind of rehab here, and that was not a project that you were looking for. So what I loved is that every time you move forward, you kept honing in what you were looking for, right? First time you're like, yeah, short-term rental on a lake, ton of work, I'll take it. And the second time you're like, nah, maybe not so much work, maybe not the short term rental, right? But then after you bought that property, you
Exactly.
had that property running for at least a year, I think, by the time that we had met. What what
I
made
think
you
so.
say now is the time for me to get some support? What is the time for me to consider a mentorship?
So I think at that point, I want to say it was about a year and a half. And, again, it was one of those things that was a kind of a one and done. And I didn't want it to be that. And, having conversations with my husband, it was like, okay, what's the next step? And it's a lot. Like I said, I probably read 3 or 4 books that most people probably start out with basic stuff, but there's only so much that you get from there. And even that, it's a little intimidating because it doesn't go into a lot of the nitty gritty.
Right.
So I wanted to be able to say, like, okay, I knew we wanted to do something else, but we weren't sure how to kind of take that step and do it. So, and then, like I said, I came across your stuff and started following the generic Facebook page with Lady Landlords,
Right.
learned so much on there, and then got introduced to the inner circle component of it. So, but yeah, I knew there was something more that we wanted to do. We just weren't sure how to tackle it, I guess.
Right. I remember that being a lot of like our beginning questions too, was about that strategy, right? I feel like there were a couple things that
Hmm.
were already the nose. We did go back, if you remember, for a very short period of time. We entertained another lake property, right? I remember that you
Hmm.
had a friend, I think, that was going away. I think maybe even you went up and said, hey, I kind of want to consider this. And then you came back very quickly and were like, nope, that was not for me. So when when you finally then had that strategy kind of in place, do you remember kind of what that structure was of what you were then going to be looking for in the Hudson Valley?
I think at first, if I remember, I was a little bit all over the place because it's kind of trial and error. Like I know, once I started working with you and listening to the other stories from the other women on the Lady Landlords, it's kind of like, okay, well, what do I want my market to be? And
Right.
I know at one point we were talking about Florida, we were talking about upstate New York, we were talking about like other surrounding areas in the tri
New
state.
Jersey
But
was
I
another
think,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, so it was kind of like a little bit all over the place at first. And with help and guidance, we're able to narrow it down as to what thought that I could tackle at the time. It doesn't mean that I'll never purchase something out of the state, but I
Right.
definitely think that I was able to get to a place that my comfort zone is something that I can physically get to myself. I'm a hands-on person. I want to know what's going on. I didn't feel comfortable working with a project manager at this early stage. Again, just still learning everything. So I think we narrowed it down that we wanted to be within a certain drivable distance of where I currently live. And then even with that, I know I never would have considered a duplex. It just wasn't on the radar at first. But, listening to the lady, speaking to you, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy that I'm even going to consider this. But it did. And it was kind of a similar process once I started working back with the same realtor. Is we kind of said, listen, this is where we're at. The difference with this purchase from the first purchase is that we were financing this purchase. The first purchase we did with cash. So this purchase was going to be a lot different in that regard, which again, for me was a huge
Right.
learning experience. I haven't had a mortgage since we bought this house 20 plus years ago. So
Right.
that was different. So even that, I was like, okay, this is going to be a little nerve wracking. And that was nerve wracking.
Correct. I'm glad though we spent time going through that market research. I'm glad we did spend a
Hmm.
few weeks doing that because Florida on paper once again sounded like a fantastic idea. I know once again you were looking into New Jersey for one of your children that was going to be in school in that area. So we
Yep.
were trying to figure out what we could possibly do there. So I'm glad you went through that exercise because just as important to realize something that you don't want to do as much as it is something that you do want to do. And I think as we
Hmm.
went through the process, we realized how busy your schedule still was. That even though you have
Hmm.
four, let's call them grown kids at 18 and plus now, how much they really still needed you and how many things you were still taking on as kind of the person that runs your household. That I think the idea of saying, oh,
Hmm.
well, let's just go drive to Jersey on a Tuesday afternoon was not really in the cards and as accessible. So I'm glad we spent that time really kind of focusing down that market. And then that's where we had to go back to what type of property we're looking for. And you settled on duplex and you settled on long term rental. And then also
Hmm.
looking for how was this going to be financed? You had options within that. And we talked about a couple different types of loans and then finally settled in the place that just made the most sense specifically for you. But once we had those things in place, it was okay, great. Now go find property. Now you're in New
Yeah.
York in a competitive market right outside New York City. What was that
Hmm.
like looking at properties, looking at the price of properties, looking at how fast the properties were moving? What was your experience like going through that?
It was similar to the first time, but a little bit different again because I was looking more for the duplex property. But yeah, I mean, we're in bidding wars up here. So, and I didn't want to go down that road. I mean, again, we're fortunate in the sense of, this is what we had, this is what we were willing to spend. My realtor was great and we were able to start working with a mortgage broker, so we were able to see what we had to work with, and
Right.
we kind of let that dictate us. We had a general area of the, Orange County, and but again, I think I put in offers on at least two other places that we didn't get, simply because they ended up going in at way over asking. And we weren't comfortable with that. Again,
Right.
what I've learned in this process is I need it to be profitable. It's great to have it, but it's another thing for it to actually bring in a little bit of money. Um,
Correct.
so I didn't want to purchase something that was going to end up not being profitable from day one. So we were picky, and it was probably a good couple of months. I think I started back in the end of October, beginning of November, and we just closed at the end of April once we found something. And that piece came very quickly. Once we found this property, I would say from start to finish was maybe 2 weeks. Well, not to close, but 2 weeks before we had the accepted offer, etc. Yeah.
Right. So for those, couple months and putting in offers and getting outbid and trying to move forward from that point, I mean, let's be honest here. Was there a point where you were frustrated, disappointed, annoyed that you either weren't getting the offers or that, just it was taking you still time to find a cash flowing property in New York?
Absolutely. I mean, and then you second guess, and I had gone back at one point and said, okay, I'm going to change my market. I'm going to go to a cheaper market and see what I can find there. But
Right.
fortunately, with the guidance of you and the other ladies, it's like, no, like, stick to the path that you have. You have it for a reason. You know what you want and what you're comfortable doing. So it's hard. Be patient and wait for that. But I am definitely glad because, again, I'm very fortunate that the next property is maybe 15 minutes from my current home. So that's
Right.
been great. I'm over there probably every day at this point until I get renters. So for the last few months, it's been very busy, but it's nice to have something that I can physically get to myself.
Right. And it's also not as big of a time stressor once again to drive the 15
Hmm.
minutes to it. What do you think would have happened, or what do you think that would have looked like if you had either one chased the bidding wars and said, okay, no, I have to raise my offer. No, I'm going to go all out on that. Or if then you said, that's it. I'm done looking in Orange County, New York. Let's scrap this, go back to square one. What do you think that would have looked like?
I mean, I think if I'm glad I didn't push for certain properties that because again, they wouldn't have been profitable. If I had gone over a significant amount from what they were asking, it wouldn't have made sense. And it would have been great that I could have said, "Oh, yes, I have this property in my portfolio." But the whole point of doing this is to be able to make some passive income from it,
Right.
aside from the value that you'll have from the ownership, etc. But once you get tenants in there, the goal is to obviously be able to bring home a little bit of extra money. But it's hard to kind of just sit back and wait and see that right thing. And even now, as I sit here, the property just went live yesterday. So, my fingers are crossed that we're going to get what we're looking for.
Right.
Along each step of this journey has been a little bit of stress. And honestly, like I probably would have walked away if it weren't for having the mentorship and stuff, honestly. Because if you don't see and hear those experiences from other people, it gets to be like even the piece about the mortgage. I know when I was chatting with you and chatting with the other ladies, not that misery loves company, but you're certainly happy to hear that everybody's kind of going through the same thing. I mean, I literally
Right.
joked with you at one point, I thought I had to give them a kidney at one point.
Right.
I mean, every time I turned around, they're asking me for different paperwork, asking me for different stuff. And I was like, this is not normal, but it was normal.
Correct.
So I was thankful to have that because otherwise I would have been like, I'm not doing this and walked away.
I remember how frustrated you were on the call because once again, that was then new because the property before that you had bought in cash, right? And that's much easier, less
Right.
paperwork, all that type of thing. And I remember you saying that too about like, what do they want next? My kidney. Like I've sent them this paperwork, then they ask me for the more paperwork. The more I send them, the more they ask
Yep.
for. And I was actually really happy that I felt like on that call, I could reassure you, it's not just you. There was no
Hmm.
problem. There was nothing wrong. That's just the process for the type of mortgage that you were also going through. So I think it was really nice.
Right.
And I'm happy that I was able to be there to kind of walk you off the ledge, right? To kind of also just kind of like center you
Yeah.
back down with being like, listen, this is part of the process. It's going to suck. But this is what we go through. And even then, when you ended up closing on the property and had an issue or two that you were not expecting, there were already things that you knew going
Hmm.
into it that were going to need some work and need some adjustments for it. Then we had, I think, within a week of you closing, some of the worst rains we've had in New York in the
Yeah.
past year. What happened to your property in the first week?
Well, we discovered one of the evenings my husband went over to put the new locks on the door. So it was, I literally think 2 or 3 days after we closed. And he went over to change the locks and took video of the water coming down the main street. This property sits on the corner. So it's the last street on a hill, basically. And not all, a good portion of the water that was coming down the street was and then entering into our driveway, which this particular driveway, it's paved directly up to the house. The house itself is already old. It was 1900 house. So we already
Mm-hmm.
knew there was a little bit of moisture issue in the basement that we were going to have to look into. Fine, again, old property, you're going to have to do some work. But this was significant because now it's just basically pouring in and in different areas of the basement.
Right.
So that's been an issue that we've had to now tackle over the last week and a half, 2 weeks.
What I think is the craziest about that is, unfortunately, an inspection would have not have caught that unless same thing. There was, a
Hmm.
hurricane type floods the week before, and even so, like the problem was not the problem wasn't necessarily starting on your property. The problem was really starting in the street And then as we've kind of talked about over
Mhm.
the past week, like this involves now the town and what's their responsibility, not just yours, right? So
Exactly.
it's just once again, kind of coming back to, misery, love, and company here. We're not sitting around just complaining about things, but it's the idea to come into and be like, I can't believe this happened, right? This is now a problem with what the city has been
Mhm.
going through, something that they actually are responsible to also take care of. And yet now, how is that impacting your property and how are you able to move forward from that point in time? So I'm glad that we've been
Mhm.
able to kind of talk through also what to do, because those are things. And I think that to me is a great way to epitomize landlording. Is there are just things that you
Yeah.
cannot predict, you cannot expect. You can, as good as your leases, as
Exactly.
good as your mortgages, as good as your contracts are, there's just always going to be something that will pop up inevitably that's out of our
Mhm.
control that we have to handle. And that's kind of how what we get paid for within Lady Landlords, right? With being a landlord.
Right. Exactly.
So
Which then a
I
huge learning curve. I mean, it's hard to not want to walk away sometimes from that because so much has still popped up. Even today I was on the phone with somebody that I'm like, okay, there's, another $600 for something that I have to fix. And, it's hard to not get discouraged and just kind of keep, the goal in mind. But it's helpful, like I said, to have a support system. So
what kept you going? What was the motivation? Why didn't you just say, screw this? I don't want to send these people more bank statements. I'm tired of looking at properties being outbid. What kept you going?
I think this was like a new phase of something that I wanted to make work. And it was something
Right.
that, I wanted to make work enough that, at least for this second property. Now it's like three doors. And I know at one point I joked on the call that I don't know how people continue to have 12, 13 doors because after what I just went through, I can't imagine doing it again. But, I think you were one of the other women made the joke about it's the same thing when you're pregnant. I mean, somehow I managed to have four kids even after the first one and you hated life. But yeah, so I mean, as I sit here now, I'm not ready to buy the next one, but I could potentially see it because there also is a piece of it that's, at least for me personally, it is rewarding, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. It's like a piece of something that, I'm going over there, I'm fixing things, I'm hiring people, I'm, trying to work out details. And that's also a huge learning experience. I mean, I had to go and haggle with a person recently to get like $130 back just because I didn't want to get taken advantage of. And
Yeah.
if you had told me that that was going to happen, I would have said no way. But it was like the principle for me. I was like, I'm getting my $130 back.
Good for you. I want to come back to that rewarding part in a second here. But one of the other situations that popped up over the time of us working together was also you kind of, I'm doing air quotes over here, going back to work, right? This was your thing. Real estate
Hmm.
was your thing. And that now also conflicted with your other family responsibilities, with kid boundaries. How did you
Hmm.
navigate that?
I mean, again, just learning from some of the strategies that some of the other women had done. And it was hard. It's still hard. It's not
Yeah.
something that you just switch off. And I think it was for me to be able to say, hey, listen, I'm serious about this. This is something that I really want to do. I really want to make it work. And it's hard when you're accessible 24/7 for the last 24 years. And it's not to mean that I'm not accessible, but it's just, it has been different, but it's been good. And I think it's good for all of us because sometimes, as stay at home moms, we tend to almost do too much. At least I know I'm guilty of that sometimes. And I've heard that sometimes on the calls with the other ladies that, it's nice for us to be able to have an opportunity that we're doing something that's rewarding for us and isn't
Right.
necessarily in the forefront benefiting them. Ultimately, you hope financially it's going to benefit my family, but it's not something that I'm doing for them in the current environment. It's something that I'm doing to have pride and ownership and move forward and ultimately, give some financial stability to the family as a whole.
Right. Why was that important for you to have your own thing too?
I just think, again, for me personally, it was, and not that it wasn't like that I didn't didn't feel worthy of what I had done, but it's just different when you haven't contributed
Yeah.
financially for over 24 years in the family. And again, I get it. We've saved a lot of money by my not having gone back to work on daycare and things of that nature, but it was just something that I wanted to be able to say, hey, this is something that I was able to do. And
Mhm.
again, I'm not saying that I did it completely on my own. I mean, again, besides the support that I've had with you guys, it is a little bit of a team effort. You've met my husband. It's like,
Yeah.
we are a cohesive unit. I'm not, just taking family monies and being like, oh, this is what I'm doing with the family money. Like, that's not
No.
how we operate. So it is a true, partnership in that sense, but he's also been able to give me, you know, the steps to be like, okay, this is, you've got this. So, which
Right.
is great.
And I love that you guys had those conversations. And I know sometimes that was a homework for you and Brian to chat through
Yeah.
those things, to see what things are going to look like, to see how that was going to be structured. That came into place a lot in the financing conversations. And I'm glad that you did this. And I also love, and I kind of want to give a little shout out to Brian here, how also supportive he was to make sure that you had the ownership, that you had the decision making abilities on how you want to move forward. Once again, it wasn't like he gave you a blank check and said, "Here you go, honey," right? Even though I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
stay at home mom, you deserve that. But I love the fact that it was still like, hey, this is now my turn to grow something. This is now the thing that I'm passionate about and the thing that I want to be able to create. And I love the fact that not only was he in a position to, but was also open to saying, yeah, I think this would be not only great for the family, but this is also going to be great for Stacy too. And that made me really happy to be
Right.
able to see. And I love
Exactly.
that you guys were able to work together on that. So now we got a duplex. So
Yeah.
you said it's now live and you're looking to get those
Yep.
2 units filled, right?
Hmm.
So we are now here at the end of May. And what's great in New York is that there's still a really good chance to have at least one of those units filled by June 1st.
Yes. I mean, that's the hope, but we'll
Yeah.
see. I know we're getting ready to head into a holiday weekend, but again, the listing is live and my realtor told me that she'll let me know as soon as somebody reaches out to see the property. So,
Nice.
and it's just kind of like a waiting game at this point. So we're hoping we priced it right. We went through a bunch of stuff, her and I, and stuff again that I've learned on our calls as far as like comps and how to price it and what they'll have access to, what other extra things that we're doing. I mean, I know one of our last conversations was as boring as it is about paving, but it's a
Right. Yeah.
huge help because, you don't think about these things, but when you're able to kind of bounce ideas off of other people who have been doing this a long time, again, I'm not looking to add more work as far as landscaping. So it made sense to get rid of a little patch of grass that was there and extend the driveway. So little things like that. It's just been, you know, pricing everything out and keeping the ball rolling. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed with some hopefully good news that I'll be able to bring to one of our calls in the near future.
I will always remember now that we did have an entire conversation about paving and
Yeah.
and how part and exactly, and we talked about maybe making a map, but I think that was such an important conversation because you're right. Those are the things that like don't come up and you're not going to read in a book. You're not going to, well, I guess you will see it in the
Hmm.
YouTube here on Lady Landlords, but like those were things that like I feel like you don't necessarily think about until all of a sudden you buy a property. And I remember even that conversation started with, oh well, this little grassy area, people would probably put like a barbecue on it. And I was like, no, we don't want barbecues. And
Yes.
you were like, oh, fantastic.
Yep.
I would prefer no barbecues. And I was like, barbecues, fire pits. Trust me, your insurance broker is going to be really upset if those things happen. And I'm glad then that we were able to talk through how to structure that, how that should look, and brainstorm those things. And to me, that's the beauty of community. That's the beauty of Lady Landlords
Hmm.
is to be able to have a place to brainstorm, to bounce ideas off of, and to see how other people have handled the situation that you're now experiencing. So, once again, crazy that we had an entire conversation about paving, but I think you saved yourself thousands of dollars of problems in the possible future
Hmm.
and also thousands of hours of headaches, depending on what that would have looked like otherwise. And I think that's completely worth it.
Exactly. And it just goes to show that and this is something I've learned from many of the women who have, 4, 5, 6 properties, is that each property is so different and unique that even though I
Right.
might have learned something from the first two, this one is not the same. You
Right.
know, again, I took advantage of the fact that the other property is an HOA. So I didn't have to worry about any of these things because it's dictated for them, for my tenants, and really for me. You know, I'm not making those decisions. It's coming from an HOA guidebook that's this thick. So,
Right.
you know, whereas for this, it's something that I need to be able to put in my lease. I need to make sure they're adhering to. So definitely a learning curve with some of that as well that I didn't have with the other property.
And that's how it should be as you move forward. The first property that you don't own anymore, that was more work, right? That was more rehab, that was zoning,
Hmm.
that was permitting, all those things. Those were new skills for you. The second one, fine, was an HOA, but that was also getting your first set of renters in. It was taking those steps to become that landlord and going through that process first. Now, this time, there's a little more confidence, a little more knowledge, and a little more education that says, hey, I can take on a duplex. I am now ready to be a landlord for 2 units that I am also then
Hmm.
managing rather than something that I'm losing a cut of my profit to an HOA. So I love that
Right.
each property should grow skills, grow confidence, and start compounding to the next one that says, you know what, I can take on something a little different. So I know we're not there. I know we're not there for the next baby house
Yeah.
here, but what after you get this rented, what do you see happening next?
I mean, it's as crazy as it is because again, it's still so fresh. It's only been, you know, a month and a half, 2 months, and it's
Right.
not rented yet. But, you know, I definitely could see hopefully just continuing to build the portfolio. And, you know,
Right.
that is the goal is to, you know, have it make sense for us and what we're looking for. And, you know, you use the example of my daughter who's down in New York City for school. So at one point we were thinking of New Jersey. Would I go back to contemplating that? Maybe. You know, again, am I looking to do it within the next month? Definitely not. But it's something that I think it's still on the radar to see how we can possibly grow, take what we've learned, take the monies that we're hopefully getting from these properties and being able to put them into something else. So I could
Right.
certainly see it in the future. I just don't know yet how far away.
That's okay. And I think it's fantastic that your focus is where it should be, which is you just bought a property. Let's get that rented. Let's get that making money and then take a deep breath and then we can discuss the next one.
Yeah,
I love it.
exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
Stacey, thank you so
So
much for being here. I appreciate you walking through that story. And just, I feel like that's also great to encourage others to stick true to what their buy box is, to say, this is what I'm looking
mhm.
for, and I'm going to stick to it. So thank you very much. I appreciate you going through your journey up until this point and can't wait to see where you go next with this.
Thank you. I appreciate all the guidance that I've gotten, and it's been amazing. So I can't wait to see where it goes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stacy. For all of our other listeners out there, thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Lady Landlords Podcast. Please do make sure to hit that follow button if you're watching this live on Facebook. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to the Lady Landlords Podcast wherever you do listen to podcasts, or you can always find us on YouTube with new episodes every single Tuesday. Thanks so much and see you next Tuesday.
Thank you for listening to the Lady Landlords Podcast. If you're feeling stuck in your real estate investing journey, visit lady-landlord.com to book a 15-minute orientation call with me and see if you're ready to join our mentorship program. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter and join our Facebook group for exclusive real estate investing tips and offers. Invest with confidence. Become a Lady Landlord today.